right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 26, the Affluent Society. So, in this chapter, we're going to focus more on the domestic side of American history following World War II. Broadly speaking, the Affluent Society is about the decade of the 1950s. And more or less from here on out, as far as American history is concerned, it's more or less broken down decade by decade by decade. So we'll do the 1950s here, in the next chapter, 1960s, 1970s, and so on. So what do we mean by affluent society? What does this refer to? Well, the affluent society is the post World War II expansion of the American economy. And arguably, it is the period of the, we'll say, highest economic growth in U.S. history. So we're talking about a decade where, again, it's hard to compare, maybe the 1920s, maybe some earlier times in which the U.S. economy grows quite as significantly in this decade. So it's unparalleled economic growth. Standards of living. Rose for all Americans. And especially considering the recent history, we have to recall that Americans are going from depression, the Great Depression, the worst economic suffering in American history, to the war years. And recall that, even though Americans found employment during the war, even though the economy was recovering, because of things like rationing and because there weren't a lot of consumer goods available, yes, Americans were making money and yes, Americans weren't employed, but they weren't really buying anything. And so the standard of living didn't rise all that much during World War II, even though other economic metrics like wages and employment were trending in the right direction. We might think about World War II as a period where Americans are saving, 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 saving. And then once the war is over and the economy transitioned from a wartime economy to a consumer economy, that's when the affluent society takes hold. Now, your textbook poses a very important point for this period of the 1950s and the affluent society, and that is, was this a period that was affluent for all? Right? And the answer is no, that there was an entire other America. And in fact, some historians have referred to the quote unquote other America during the affluent period to point out that not all Americans enjoyed the affluent society at the same degree or at the same level. Most Americans benefited. Standards of living rose on average, but there were certain segments of the population that were left behind. And so your textbook looks specifically at the status of women, African Americans during the affluent society, especially with the civil rights movement unfolding, those that were poor or poverty stricken. And it also looks at the affluent society through a lens that we haven't really looked through all that much yet, and that is the environment. What does this unprecedented consumption, right, buying things, what impact does that have on the environment? So, yes, it's an affluent society for most. It's affluent for Americans on average, but is it affluent for all? The answer is no. So, what do we see as far as affluency goes? Well, we're talking mostly about the purchasing of things, material standards of living. There's some statistics related to American consumption in the 1950s that suggest that perhaps Americans during the 1950s were purchasing 50% of all commodities that were being purchased around the world, despite only being 5% of the population. So it's an unprecedented level of consumption given American history, but even compared to the rest of the world. And among the things that were purchased, maybe one of the more significant ones were houses or homes. And Americans who purchased homes at an unprecedented level changed the American landscape. It gave rise to what we refer to as suburbs. A suburb, plainly put, this is a residential area, we'll say on the outskirts of the city. It is essentially block after block after block after block of residential home. And during the Affluent Society, during the 1950s, the suburbs grew significantly, right, as the section title suggests here. So, what made this mass purchasing of homes possible? What allowed Americans to leave the cities for the suburbs? Well, there are several contributing factors. The first one that we'll point to are government programs. And we have two government programs that made home purchasing easier for Americans, the HOLC and the FHA. These were New Deal programs. So, this was during Franklin Roosevelt's tenure in office. The HOLC, this stands for the Home Owners Loan Corporation. And the FHA, this is the Federal Housing Administration. And to make a long story short, without going into too much detail, these were programs that made the monthly slash yearly payments more affordable. So doing things like extending the length of the loan for a home mortgage so that Americans could have cheaper monthly payments. And once the monthly or yearly payments were affordable enough, then Americans could go ahead and move in. So New Deal programs provide one explanation for why Americans purchase homes. Another one was an innovation in the way that homes were built. And here we're going to point to William Levitt, who in some sense, William Levitt did for the home what Henry Ford had done to the Model T, and that was to create a new way of producing homes that made them more efficient. We'll say about William Levitt that he pioneered a method of, we'll say, mass producing identical, and this identical part is important, homes for, cheap price. So instead of building just one single home at a time, William Levitt instead built entire tracts of houses, hundreds at a time, 1,000 at a time. And one of the ways that William Levitt could cut down costs on his what they were called Levitt towns, and a Levitt town was just a massive suburban complex in which all of the homes were built at the same time and were essentially identical to each other. Sometimes they might change the decorations of the outside a little bit to make the homes look a little bit more unique, but the point is that just like every single Model T is the same, right? You might be able to get a different color. Every single house was the same. And this ability to produce homes identically and to mass produce them, again, made them cheaper. This notion of people purchasing and living in identical homes, this is going to get a little bit more towards the uniform culture of the 1950s. And we'll talk more about the uniform culture. One of the great benefits, of course, is that Americans can purchase homes now, but a drawback is that most of the consumer goods that Americans are purchasing are all identical and creates a more uniform culture. So that could be essentially reason number two. A third reason, which we'll get down here in a moment, is the automobile, which allowed Americans to commute from their workplace to their homes. Right? Remember that the suburbs were outside of the cities, but the jobs more or less remained in the cities. So you couldn't buy a house if you didn't have a reliable way of getting there. Well, the automobile is amongst the commodities purchased by Americans in the affluent society. So homes are number one. Another consumer good that drove affluency was the television, and this was, one of the many consumer goods purchased by Americans. We will say the same thing about the car. Americans say, in addition to homes and TVs, Americans bought cars. And the unique feature about the car is that it helped make suburbanization possible. Help make it possible. So we've got some statistics here to tell us a little bit of the story. Statistics, we don't want to go too overboard with them because, memorizing statistics, in my opinion, is pointless. But, sometimes they do help tell you the story, right? Especially when trying to measure something like the economy or broader society. So as far as homes go, in 1940, it is estimated that about 44% of Americans owned homes. By the year 1960, that had gone to 62%. As far as the suburbs are located, right, in terms of Americans that live there, again, we got a 1940 and a 1960 comparison. In 1940, 20% of the population lived in suburbs, 31% lived there by the 1960s. The television is really a big one because the television is the most novel technology. That didn't exist. It had been invented somewhat recently. So for the TV, if we go even just to 1950, about 12% of Americans owned a television. By 1960, that number was up to 87% of Americans had owned a television by the 1960s. So, I mean, it's almost as if in 1950 nobody had a TV. Then by 1960, everyone had a TV. And the same thing with the automobile, especially because of the Great Depression. A lot of Americans, couldn't afford to keep their cars if they had one. 1948, when the war was still going on, it was I think I have this might be wrong, but I made a typo here, but we'll go with it. By 1959, I want to say, what was this, up to 67%? Sorry, this might be not an accurate statistic here for automobiles, but essentially we can track when it comes to these goods of homes, TVs, and automobiles. All these things are increasing in ownership as far as American goes. Now, to get back to the original point, and that was, well, Americans were purchasing all these things, enjoying a new affluent lifestyle, but was this affluency for all? And we're going to look at the case of home ownership and the obstacles that African Americans faced in trying to be a part of this broader affluent society. One thing or one way that African Americans were kept out of the growing affluence that the rest of American society enjoyed was through various practices used by institutions like banks and governments. And probably the most famous or infamous of all was the practice of redlining. Redlining is a practice of limiting loans to quote unquote high risk areas, we'll say marked on a map. And so banks would literally take maps as we see here, like Atlanta and like Brooklyn, and would outline areas of the neighborhood and say, look, this area is too risky for us to provide some sort of home loan. So, as the bank, we're going to deny anyone who offers or anyone who wants a loan in these particular regions. Well, many of these redlined areas had a greater percentage of African Americans. And so it made it much more difficult for African Americans to obtain loans in the same ways that white Americans would have little to no problems doing so, and purchase a home like many white Americans did. And if the practice of redlining itself didn't make home ownership difficult enough, oftentimes these redline maps were used for other programs. All right, so there might be other programs. The example or an example is, let's say you want to take out a loan to add on to your house, right? Maybe you want to add on a living room or you want to upgrade your property. Well, banks would continue to use these red line maps, and even certain government programs would use these red line maps as a way to deny loans to people who lived in those areas. And again, those who lived in those areas oftentimes were a much higher percentage of African Americans. Now, the Supreme Court did weigh in on some of the types of housing discrimination that occurred, and it wasn't just redlining, but in earlier decades, residential units in certain areas would create contracts where they would refuse to sell to Black Americans, right? A specific type of housing discrimination. The Supreme Court case Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, this ruled, we'll say that barring sales to racial minorities in contracts was not legally enforceable. So a practice that had been going on, earlier, the Supreme Court did weigh in and essentially said, look, if you have a contract that specifically denies, an African American person or other racial minority the ability to purchase a house in a certain neighborhood, the court weighed in and said, look, well, the law is not going to enforce that. So in some ways, this was a ruling against housing discrimination. But as we will learn in this chapter, when it comes to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is definitely important in terms of setting a precedent with its ruling, but the Supreme Court doesn't have a very reliable enforcement mechanism. And enforcement of the decisions by the Supreme Courts is almost an entirely different question. So even though the Supreme Court did rule against it, it was a practice that had a history and continued despite the Supreme Court ruling. So redlining is a great example of how not all Americans could be part of this growing affluent society. One other point to make here about the growing consumption, we had mentioned this earlier, is on the environment. And there are lots of different ways that we could discuss the effects or environmental effects of this massive rise of consumption, but perhaps one of the most well-known was a book that was published. I want to say it was the 1960s, and that was Silent Spring. And this was a book published about the environmental impact on chemicals And pesticides. I think specifically pesticides might have been the part that was under scrutiny here. Specifically, what book published about the environmental impact of chemicals? Sorry. DDT specifically, which was a pesticide used to kill bugs. They said that DDT was harmless to humans but fatal to bugs. So it seemed like a perfect chemical to use as a pesticide. Turned out that it did have some adverse effects for human populations. Um, and so this book, in a lot of ways, this became a symbol of the awareness because Americans were becoming more aware, not at first, and I would say probably not on a significant level, but certainly a small group of Americans were becoming more aware of the impact of buying all this stuff has on the environment. But we might say symbol of the awareness, over environmentalism. Section 3, race and education. So the 1950s is a very important decade for the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement, in short, we typically say that it starts in 1954 and ends in 1965. Although it's important to understand that civil rights, well, two things. In the American context, when we refer to civil rights, we typically mean the rights of African Americans. Civil rights just means civilian rights. It could refer to the rights of everyone, but very specifically in American history, the civil rights movement, we're talking about the rights of African Americans. The second point is that the civil rights movement, although we conventionally say that it started in 1954, and that's because of a Supreme Court case, it's important to understand that you've had civil rights activism ever since the ending of Reconstruction, from people like Booker T. Washington to W.E.B. Du Bois to Marcus Garvey. There had been people advocating for the rights of African Americans even before this period. So conventionally, 1954 to 1965 is when we started, or when we think about it in terms of its date. But it does have an earlier history behind it as well. The 1950s is an important decade for essentially the beginning of the civil rights movement. And we're going to begin first with the realm of education. So let us just recall the legal status of African Americans in the southern United States since the ending of Reconstruction. And that is a society where the quote unquote separate but equal clause really reigns supreme. This was the decision to uphold segregation by the Supreme Court in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Plessy v. Ferguson. That was 1896. And so even though that court case came in 1896, we can think about the era of the quote-unquote Jim Crow South. Again, Jim Crow South is, we'll say 1877. That's when Reconstruction ends, until the conclusion of the Civil Rights Movement. So nearly 100 years here. And what we mean by segregation is that in the South, all of the institutions were separated between white and black. There were white and black hospitals, white and black schools, white and black restaurants. The idea was that legally, these were equal, so that it wouldn't be a violation of the 14th Amendment. If we recall, the 14th Amendment says everyone is subject to the same law. But a workaround or a way to bypass the 14th Amendment was to separate institutions, call them equal on the surface. That way it didn't violate the 14th Amendment. But in reality, it was created an entire second-class citizenship for African Americans in the South. So what's important is that there had already been a series of court cases that had been dealing with segregation, but kind of in ancillary ways. The big bomb that was detonated in regards to segregation was the Brown versus Board decision in 1954. In fact, it was so big that typically we associate it with the beginning of the civil rights movement. This was a case about racial segregation in public schools. And public schools, again, there's probably no bigger or maybe more important institution because we're talking about people's children here. And the Supreme Court heard the decision about segregation, the types of effects, detrimental effects that it had. Was it a violation of the 14th Amendment? And what the Supreme Court ruled in a 9-0 decision, so we're say court ruled in a 9-0 decision. That means everybody on the Supreme Court agreed. Decision that, quote, separate educational facilities, so separate schools, is inherently unequal. All right, so separate, and this was very important, separate is inherently unequal. In other words, the Supreme Court said that this earlier court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, it did violate the 14th Amendment. In their decision of Brown versus Board, what this did was this overruled, I might say, make this a little bit more clear. Brown overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling. Now, they had this court case related to public schools. That's what the court case was concerned over. And essentially, the Brown versus Board decision was several earlier court cases combined together, but they all had to do with public schooling, right? The fact that a lot of states had white schools and black schools, and denying black students the ability to go to tax-funded schools. They argued that was a violation of the 14th Amendment, and everyone in the court essentially agreed. So this was a big ruling, and the implications was that it wasn't, or it's not simply just going to apply only to educational facilities, but if separate is inherently unequal in education, then it must also be unequal in every other instance of segregation. And so the court finally coming down and saying, look, segregation is unconstitutional, that had huge, huge implications. It didn't mean that the civil rights movement was over by any stretch. As we just discussed in the last section, Supreme Court rulings are important, but what about the enforcement? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Now, building up to the Brown versus Board decision, there were a lot of very important workings going on in the background, one of them being the NAACP. And we've talked about the NAACP before. This was the largest civil rights group in the U.S. And their strategy during the 1940s and 1950s was to hire very expensive and very well-educated, a largest civil rights group in the U.S. in the 1940s and 1950s hired lawyers to fight civil rights cases. So, for example, if there was a court case that was brought before, maybe even just like a small little courtroom, right? Maybe in a very rural part of the South, and the people who were bringing the court case. Maybe they didn't have a lot of resources or a lot of money to fund very expensive lawyers. Well, the NAACP would buy, right, very good lawyers, send them out to the rural parts of the South and have them fight in the courtrooms. And, one major component of the civil rights movement is the legal battle. It's not the only component, right? But one theater that the civil rights movement was fought was in the courtrooms, right? Very expensive lawyers arguing over amendments and constitutions and everything like that. An example of one of these earlier cases that led to the Brown decision was Briggs versus Elliott. So this was an earlier, say, court case about segregation in, this was South Carolina schools. And they were able to prove the but equal aspect of the 14th Amendment was not being applied. Prove that the states spent $179 per white student and was it 43 per black student. So at the very least, the but equal part of the separate but equal ruling by the Supreme Court was very clearly not being applied to South Carolina schools. So in terms of fighting this in the courtroom, you could look at segregation from an economic standpoint. You could look at it from a legal standpoint. But there were also some who viewed segregation through the lens of psychology. And one of the more famous experiments, or one of the more famous incidents, was the Clark doll experiment. This was an experiment into the, we'll say, psychological impact of segregation. So what the experiment entailed was they had a group of white girls, they had a group of black girls, right? So young girls, elementary school age, and then they presented them with white dolls and black dolls, and they wanted to see which ones did the girls prefer. In the experiment, the white girls, they preferred the white dolls. The black girls also preferred the white dolls. And as a result of this experiment, they were able to prove that segregation simply goes beyond the economics, it goes beyond the legal, it goes beyond the social or even political, and it has deep psychological impacts. And so this was included into the arguments that lawyers use in order to bring an end to segregation, racial segregation in the United States. So all of these things going on in the background, the NAACP, earlier court cases, experiments, all of this helped contribute to the overall Brown decision. Now, when Brown was decided, there was an entire additional question about enforcement. Now, initially, the Supreme Court wasn't very specific about when the enforcement of desegregating the schools would take place, or integrating, as they would call that. The Supreme Court ruled, quote unquote, with all deliberate speed. But once again, the Supreme Court would have to rely upon, deliberate speed. The Supreme Court would have to rely upon other institutions to enforce their decision, namely the executive branch via the U.S. president and commander-in-chief of the military, and the states. Again, states have their own police force, they have their own militias, they have their own resources for enforcement. And it turned out that, as 1954 turned into 1955 into 1956, most schools in the South weren't desegregating, right, at all. I think only 2 states actually took an active approach to doing that. And The most famous clash of this, or the most famous incident, was to happen in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, which your textbook doesn't actually describe, but they do include pictures from Little Rock. So, a little bit of background of what happened in Arkansas in 1957, is helpful. Little Rock, Arkansas was ordered, or Central High School, excuse me, was ordered to desegregate via the courts. And in 1957, the first black students were set to attend Central High School, which had been an all-white high school up until that point. They were called the Little Rock Nine. Little Rock Nine, the first nine black students to attend, Central High School. And what they were met with on the very first day were mobs. Not just mobs, the governor and state, I don't know, we'll call them state troops. I don't remember exactly what branch they were in, denied the students' entry. And this was being actively caught on, and we'll talk more about the significance of this technology, but Americans could see this unfolding on television, right? Television was a new medium by which Americans gathered information, and it ends up having an effect. The images that are coming out of the South during the civil rights movement and broadcasted on television for the entire world to see, it does have an impact for people to change their mind, or maybe even inform people around the country what exactly is going on here. So with with Central High School denying the Little Rock Nine the ability to go to school, mobs of people, the governor, state troops were called in. This became a national scandal, and the president at the time, Eisenhower, was forced to respond, and he responded in fact, a very important and significant way. And Eisenhower responded by sending in federal troops to ensure the Little Rock Nine went to school. And that's the image that you see in this picture here with these soldiers, right? Literally paratroopers, I think, escorting black students to their classes, and they did that throughout the entire year. So Eisenhower, by sending in troops to make sure that the Little Rock Nine could go to school, that was a very important signal, because it meant that Eisenhower was enforcing the Supreme Court decision. That was important coming from the executive branch. He was overruling local governments, right? Despite what the governor was doing and using state troops, the federal intervention was overruling the state of Arkansas. And maybe most importantly was that when Eisenhower sent federal forces into Little Rock, Arkansas, he was sending a message to all of the other states saying, look, if you try and defy the order by the Supreme Court, you can expect a very similar response. And so this was maybe more important for Eisenhower to send a message to all the other states of the South to say, look, don't try and mess with the Supreme Court's decision. I, as the president, I'm essentially willing to enforce it. So what schools did in response to this was many schools just closed down their district, right? They would rather close down their schools than integrate them. They set up private schools that cost money, so provided a barrier to entry. And in fact, when we talk about integration or desegregation, integration of schools, so the actual schools in which had white and black students attending the same schools did not come, until, you know, 1968, 1969, 1970. Section 4, Civil Rights in an Affluent Society. So last section we talked about Brown versus Board and said that one of the major theaters of the civil rights movement was in the courtrooms. And this went beyond just the public schools, but in other areas where segregation was practiced. So we have another court case here. This one, Sarah Keys versus the Carolina Coach Company. This is a Supreme Court case involving segregation on interstate buses. So Sarah Keys refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus. And she sued. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and eventually in this court case, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on interstate, and this is an important distinction. So interstate means between states. So if a bus is going over state lines, from one state to another, Supreme Court ruled segregation on interstate buses is unconstitutional. So this would have been a court case that favored the civil rights movement. Now, one of the reasons why this gets mentioned here is because in the next chapter, there is a series of civil rights activism called the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Rides are in order to, we'll say, the Freedom Rides test this ruling. So somewhat similar to the court case of Brown versus Board is that we typically see that the Supreme Court is ahead when it comes to making decisions in favor of the civil rights movement, but then it takes a while for it to be forced. So this is the court case that made the Freedom Riders possible. Again, that's covered in next chapter, but this ruling preceded it. The civil rights movement gained, sympathy and support from various avenues. One we had talked about earlier was the role of television. And a lot of the civil rights activism, the grassroots protests, in the case of Little Rock, Arkansas, the broadcasting of the struggles of the civil rights movements, into American homes across the country helped to garner more sympathetic support. There were other incidents or other episodes that shocked and horrified Americans. Probably none other more infamous than the murder of Emmett Till. And Emmett Till was a African American boy who was mutilated and murdered while visiting Mississippi. The murderers, we'll say the trial, found the murderers not guilty. It was a segregated courtroom, an all-white jury. So those who were responsible for the murder of Emmett Till got off scot-free. Emmett Till's mother held an open casket funeral to show the world. And when, Americans were exposed to the body of this young boy who had been murdered in Mississippi and there was no justice for those who were responsible for it, it, created a lot of, anger and, in some ways motivation for the civil rights movement. Again, gaining a lot of sympathy as far as the civil rights movement is concerned. Now, when we think about the tactics or strategy that civil rights employs, one we had said was that it was in the courtrooms. That there's a certain aspect of civil rights that is legal. Is it constitutional? Does separate but equal violate the 14th Amendment? But there's another, arena or theater of the civil rights movement that we're going to call the grassroots. And grassroots is more like everyday people. Most people are not lawyers arguing, Supreme Court cases and segregation in the court system. Most people are just everyday people. And a lot of what made civil rights possible was the actions of everyday people. And one of the earliest and one of the more significant grassroots movements was the Montgomery bus boycott, which took place, I want to say, in 1955. The Montgomery bus boycott, this was a boycotting of the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama, for their policy requiring Black Americans to sit in the back. That's what, back of the bus. So that was the policy that the bus system had, right? A segregatory policy, which white passengers were allowed to sit in the front. Black passengers were required to sit in the back by law. The boycott of the busing system, because in order for the bus system to exist economically, it needed to sell tickets. And if people were no longer willing to ride the bus, the idea was to put economic pressure on the busing system in Montgomery, Alabama, in order to force them to change their policies. The boycott began when Rosa Parks, she refused to give up her seat and was arrested. And this started, we'll say her arrest started the bus boycott. So she was, I believe, coming home from work or wherever she was coming home from, and she had sat on the bus in the front. When a white passenger came in, they told Rosa Parks that she had to give up her seat. Rosa Parks said no, and the police came and arrested her. And so, it was from this action that you had hundreds, if not thousands, of other people in Montgomery, Alabama for the next year or so not take the bus system. They walked to work, sometimes an hour, 2 hours just to walk to work. They carpooled together, did what was required in order to, force Montgomery to change their system. And ultimately, and this is, an important maybe outcome or consequence of the bus boycott, eventually, Montgomery a bus system changed their policy. So when we think about the Montgomery bus boycott and one of the reasons why it is significant, one was because it was successful, right? This was a grassroots movement that ultimately achieved the goal that it sought out to do. A second reason why the Montgomery bus boycott was significant was it provided the civil rights movement with a leader, excuse me, and that is to say, Martin Luther King Jr. will say that he emerged as the leader of the civil rights movement. From Montgomery. At the time, Martin Luther King Jr. was a young man. I want to say he was still in his 20s at this point. Um, he was highly educated, earned his PhD from Boston University, and was a minister. And so he had not just a gift, but he had the skill of being able to speak to audiences, with his religious background. And from the Montgomery bus boycott, he essentially, you go into that boycott with the civil rights movement not really having a face to the entire movement, and King emerges essentially as as a leader. So one, from Montgomery, it was successful. Two was that a leader emerged, and three was that a blueprint for future, um, we'll say grassroots activism, and that was nonviolence and what they called civil disobedience. The strategy of nonviolence worked in Montgomery, and so for civil rights activists, in the years afterwards, they can look back on Montgomery and say, "Look, here's the blueprint that they followed. Here's what they did, and it led to success for them." Civil disobedience means to break unjust laws. Civil disobedience was what Rosa Parks was practicing. So the blueprint for success has been achieved. And so when we look at Montgomery, we typically say those are the three important outcomes. It was successful, a leader emerged for the civil rights movement, and a blueprint for success was provided for the future. Martin Luther King Jr. would go on to organize further protests, grassroots activism as far as civil rights is concerned. He led the organization known as the SCLC. This stands for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And, when we explore some of the other maybe wings of the civil rights movement, into the 1960s and so forth, we'll just take note of the different demographics that are represented. For King, King is really attacking segregation and Jim Crow from a Christian perspective, talking a lot about, God, equality in the eyes of God, what is the godly thing to do. King also, for the most part, is coming from the South, even though he himself is very young at the time. He does represent, or his SCLC does represent kind of more of a, middle-age, religious, Southern wing of civil rights, whereas organizations like the NAACP, they're primarily in the North. They're urban. They're taking it from a legal perspective. So there's a lot of different organizations that come together, all pushing for the same goal. The SCLC and the NAACP are two examples of that. Section 5, Gender and Culture in the Affluent Society. So there's probably no single invention more important in shaping American culture than the television. And that would definitely be true in the 1950s, maybe even true in all of American history. When we think about culture, again, culture is the beliefs, attitudes, expectations, stereotypes. They're typically not things that we can measure quantitatively, but certainly exist. And the relationship between television and culture in the 1950s is that American culture was, we'll say influenced, but we might even say something like, dominated, influenced by TV. And, there were several reasons as to why that was the case. One was we looked at ownership. And I don't remember the exact statistic in the last chapter, but I think by the end of the 1950s, it was something like 89% of Americans owned TV. So everybody had a TV, everybody was watching it. Americans on average watch 5 hours a day. So a lot of television was being consumed by the American public, and to make maybe the culture more uniform, there were only three channels. There wasn't a lot of variety. Earlier we had said, one of the cultural indicators of the 1950s is a uniform culture, meaning that there's not a lot of individualism or not a lot of maybe diversity. The fact that there were only three channels to watch meant that pretty much everyone was watching the same programs, viewing the same advertisements. And so there was a very far and powerful reach for this reason. It also meant, so for example, we said that American culture was influenced by TV. One of the very common cultural indicators was gender roles. And on television during the 1950s, men or males were portrayed as the breadwinners, those who were working outside the home, and the females or the women, they were portrayed generally as homemakers. And we get a little bit of a sense for those gender roles here in this advertisement about, I think they're advertising like kitchen appliances or something. This looks like a washer and dryer, actually. This looks like a stove, some sort of advertisement here. And so, these types of cultural norms, the men are expected to work, women are expected to take care of the home, families are expected to have, 2 or 3 children, something along those lines. They're up to date in purchasing the newest consumer goods. These were all characteristic of the television shows, and from Americans watching these TV shows, their behaviors and attitudes were shaped and molded by that. So that's just one example. Now, as far as the types of television that were available to Americans, there was some variety, but not as much variety as you might imagine. Definitely not like TV today. Some of the popular TV shows in the 1950s included Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, I Love Lucy. These were just popular TV shows. And an interesting feature about television in the 1950s was all of these TV shows were generally uncontroversial. They were pretty tame, and we might just say that TV in the 1950s was non-controversial, right? So maybe like light humor or something along those lines. But one of the reasons why they needed to make these television shows non-divisive or non-controversial was because advertising time and space was so limited. So products like, as you see here, this is an image from a quiz show. Quiz shows, or like game shows, were one of the popular genres of TV in the 1950s. It's sponsored by a product called Geritol. And, because there were only so many hours in a day and only so many channels and only so many TV shows, the TV shows themselves had to appeal to everyone so that advertisers could use that time and money wisely. So TV in the 1950s was non-controversial due to limited time for advertisements. Right, and so any types of any TV shows that might challenge the stereotypes in American society, right? If you want to portray or have a TV show that had a family in which, I don't know, maybe the couple wasn't even wed, or maybe the husband didn't work or something like that. Producers and stuff like that, they wouldn't go for it because they would be afraid that it might turn away some of the public. I Love Lucy did push the boundaries a little bit. I mean, in that show, Lucy was still a homemaker, quote unquote homemaker. But her marriage to a Cuban American, Desi Arnaz, a non-white man, did test the boundaries just a little bit. For the most part, we're talking about pretty non-controversial, tame shows. Now, in terms of American society, not only was it shaped by television, television was a big influencer there, not just in movements like the civil rights, but everything related to culture. But a major also demographic change happened in the 1950s after World War II, and that was the baby boom. The baby boom, this is the significant increase in births in the US, especially from 1946 until 1964. And so, this is something that has, significant consequences well beyond, the baby boom period or the boomer generation. It led to an increase in economic activity. Entire industries became concerned with things like child rearing, literature about child rearing. And this was a generation that would produce for the next couple of decades a pretty decent source of labor for the country going forward as far as the economy is concerned. Why did the baby boom happen? What made it possible? Well, we'll go ahead and list two things. One is returning GIs from the war. During World War II, 16 million men were physically removed from the country. And the second thing is that the affluence made children affordable. During the Great Depression, families stopped having children because they couldn't afford it anymore. So a combination of returning GIs from the war and the affluence that made children possible led to a huge spike in the number of children being born. So we have a little bit of a picture for what American culture of the 1950s was like. It was uniform. It was consumer culture. It was, replicating what one saw on television. It was, uh, heterosexual nuclear families. That was all the norm. However, though, in the 1950s, we do find pockets in America, in the minority, I would say, that reject the conforming uniform culture of the 1950s. So we might say some Americans rejected the uniform, conforming. Conforming means like pressure to fit in, right? Where the pressure is coming from family, whether it's coming from television, where whatever. There's not a lot of people telling people just be yourself. Right? That's not indicative of 1950s culture and consumption, right? Go out and buy one of everything. So we got three examples of the types of ways that Americans rejected 1950s culture. One is through music, specifically rock and roll, and figures like Elvis Presley. And rock and roll music was a sign of more of a youthful rebellion. And, we find that the generation that was born after the war, the baby boom generation, they're a generation that did not experience the hardship that their parents did. The parents went from the Great Depression to World War II, now to this affluent society. And while, yes, this is a society that's uniform, that doesn't allow for a lot of individualism, it's conforming, it's consumer based. I mean, they more or less welcomed these things given the hard times that they had experienced before. The younger generation, they're born into affluence. So they know the only thing they know is the material standards of living that they have. And so they find flaws in the, in 1950s society, and they revolt and they rebel against that. And music was one way of doing that. Here we have Elvis Presley. On television, his nickname was Elvis the Pelvis because he danced in a way that was sexually provocative. Even television stations only showing Elvis from the waist up because The style of dance was too much for audiences to bear. Here we have a quote from the musician Bruce Springsteen, what he says about Elvis. He says, quote, Elvis gave us full access to a new language, a new form of communication, a new way of being, a new way of thinking about sex, race, identity, life, a new way of being an American. Now, eventually, rock and roll becomes mainstream, but at the time, it's something that the older generation of the 1950s sees very much as detrimental to American society. Another cultural movement is called the Beat movement. And the Beat movement is more about things like art, literature, poems. They're about pointing out all of these things, right? They criticize these features of 1950 societies. So a lot of their work, whether it's writing poems or whether it's writing books, kind of talks about this. One of the themes I would say is like the dissatisfaction with just owning a bunch of stuff, right? It's like you buy all these things and you're supposed to be happy, and the Beat generation points out that no, that's not the case. Some Americans use the term beatnik as a derogatory towards the Beat generation. Beatnik was a derivative of the Beat movement and Sputnik. Sputnik was the Soviet satellite. So the idea was that, because beatniks were criticizing American society, that they were traitors, that they were Soviet. So this was a derogatory term. And the last point in which some Americans rejected conformity, this one relating more so towards sexual and gender norms, was in creating support organizations and support groups for homosexuality. Homosexuality during the 1950s was not only culturally taboo, but it was also A, considered a mental illness, and B, illegal in many cases. And so there was a kind of subculture that began to emerge in the 1950s. We might just say that, we'll say that gay activists created secretive support groups. All right, last section, section 6, politics and ideology in the affluent society. So as far as politics are concerned, it's probably the least interesting aspect of, this 1950s period. The economic changes and the emergence of the civil rights are probably the more important parts here. But we will say a little bit about politics. And, politics did start to change. It didn't rise to the surface, but we can see the roots of political change happening in the 1950s. In that was suburban politics. And, we might just, suburban is a fine, description here, but we might maybe describe this as affluent politics. And that is to say that new fluency, again, fluency is just like prosperity, led to new politics. And of these politics, it was a belief, or one of the core beliefs, I would say, a belief in the superiority of capitalism. And this was standing in contrast to an earlier time, right? Remember that during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, that many wanted to, some wanted to completely abandon, or at the very least change capitalism. That's one. When economic times are going poorly, people might want to abandon or change the current economic system. And we did get some pretty significant changes to it in the form of the New Deal. After World War II, because of the increase in prosperity, there is once again a shift towards the superiority of capitalism and, in some ways, a rejection of the New Deal. And this is the growing ideology inside of the suburbs. We can identify this ideology a little bit more broadly, just outside of economics, to include other things like politics and stuff like that. as libertarianism. And libertarianism, this is an ideology that promotes individual liberty, property rights, and we'll say unregulated capitalism. Maybe semi-regulated or low regulations on capitalism, but libertarianism is an ideology that definitely does not agree with the New Deal, right? The New Deal was about government action in the economy. Libertarians generally want to see much less action in the economy. And this viewpoint on the economy was part of not just a larger, but really the main divide, in economic thought, and that is Keynesian versus Austrian economics. And to make this simpler, or to make it more simple, Keynesian and Austrian economics, these are two different competing ideas about what makes for a good economy. So they do conflict with each other. Generally speaking, those that support Keynesian, they support government, or might say support government, we'll say actions in the economy. We would say that the New Deal was a result of Keynesian economic thought, and Austrian economics, they generally support free market economics. So having the government do as little as possible. Another way to understand Keynesian and Austrian economics is that they both believe that the main drivers of the economy are fundamentally different. So, for example, those on the Keynesian side, they also tend to be what we call maybe demand side economics. When you think about economics, there's supply and demand. There's people or things that build things and make stuff, and there's people that consume things. Keynesians would say that really it's the consumers, the demand side, that is the priority. And as a government, we should do everything that we can in our power to make sure that the demand for goods is enough to drive the economy. So that's why a Keynesian would support something like a New Deal, because a New Deal gives money in people's pockets, right? It funds the consumer. That's why Keynesian economics would support things like Social Security, right? You are giving people money. When people have money, they can go out and buy stuff. When they can go out and buy stuff, that's what makes the economy better. The Austrian side, they disagree. They say that it's supply, right? These are not the consumers, but these are businesses. And at the end of the day, what drives the economy is not the people who buy stuff, it's the people who make stuff. So as a general policy, we should try to make it as easy as possible for businesses to make things. That generally means stuff like low taxes, right? So let businesses keep more of their money. No regulation. So let's not put rules on businesses. Let's do everything we can in order to allow the supply side to thrive. So these are two competing views as far as economics are concerned. Again, at this time, we're talking about Keynesian as those that support the New Deal, Austrian as those that support kind of this growing libertarian sense. Eventually, we will get to the point where the Keynesians, for the most part, I'm a little bit hesitant to say this, tend to be on the side of the Democrats and the Austrians on the side of the Republicans. But this is not quite yet, right? It doesn't become a major part of the Republicans really until 1980. Richard Nixon had a famous quote, Nixon the Republican, saying we're all Keynesian. So the Keynesian ideology or the Keynesian belief, thought in terms of economics does remain the prevalent one until the 1980s when the Republicans and Ronald Reagan take power. But this way of thinking in the 1950s is simply just becoming more popular, and it's in line with libertarianism and is supported by populations in the suburbs. Now, a couple of figures do emerge in the 1950s as championing this ideology. One of them is Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is the most popular, I would say, advocate. I mean, I'm an economist. That might be that might be just calling him an advocate might not be enough. Most popular advocate or economist for the Austrian school. And it wasn't just economics, but it was also in culture. There was a popular author, Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, this was a popular novelist. So she wrote a book, probably the most famous one, called Atlas Shrugged. Popular novelist, and we'll say who wrote books. With themes of individualism, right? So kind of the main point here in her novels, again, which were just stories essentially, they were rife with notions of individualism, and this matched up very well with the promotion of libertarian ideology. The point here that the textbook is making is that these are ideas that are beginning to popularize, but there's really no figure yet in American society. And I think what they're alluding to is the emergence of Ronald Reagan in the 80s, but not quite yet. As far as the actual politics of the 1950s go, if we just look at presidential politics, we'll just look at two elections, the election of 1948 and the election of 1952. Now, recall Harry Truman, who you see here. Harry Truman came into power when FDR died in office. So then Truman was promoted from VP to the president. So Americans had never voted for Truman before. Truman was the president that ended World War II. He decided or made the decision to drop the atomic weapons. He is also the one that promoted Truman Doctrine. So he was someone who wanted to aggressively pursue anti-communist action around the world. But he wasn't all that popular with the American public. And in fact, in 1948, it was Thomas Dewey, a relatively moderate Republican, running against Truman. And in fact, everybody thought that Truman was going to lose. So much so that newspapers began reporting, or began printing, I should say, newspapers that had already determined the outcome of the election the day before. And so this is one of the more iconic photos, maybe in all of presidential history, of Truman with a big smile on his face, holding up a newspaper saying that he had just lost that election. Spoiler alert, Truman actually won the 1948 election. It's one of the biggest upsets as far as presidential elections are concerned. So Truman won this one and would serve for 4 more years. Now, remember, Truman, because he was from FDR, he was a New Deal Democrat. So he definitely supported, the idea of, welfare programs. Truman had his own plan called the Fair Deal, and that's kind of where Truman stood politically as far as domestic policies were concerned. The next year, in 1952, Truman would not be running for office anymore, and it was time for the Republicans to choose who their nominee was. And what you had essentially was a difference in ideology between, on the one hand, I believe his name was, first name, Robert Taft, the son of William Howard Taft, right? So Robert Taft, he opposed the New Deal and was running much more as the conservative. If you're not familiar, the primary, right, what this means, the primary election. The primary election is what's held before the general election. It's when each party chooses who they want to run for president. So president, there's going to be a Democrat and Republican. Well, how do you know how the Democrats know who they're going to pick and how the Republicans know who they're going to pick? Well, they hold an election before that called the primary. So the primary, this is where the Republicans, they're choosing who to run. And so the primary election, this is the election where each party picks their nominee. Respell nominee. So Taft represented this kind of old school, Gilded Age, conservative Republican opposing the New Deal, right? Sort of pro-business. Eisenhower had the leg up because he was the war hero and he supported the New Deal. Right? He was a quote unquote liberal Republican, right? A liberal Republican. From Eisenhower, he says, quote, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. So this quote shows that Eisenhower supported the New Deal. And when he did become president, he did not actively dismantle it. So we should say that not only did Eisenhower not only won the primary, the opposition to the New Deal was defeated, he won also the general election. And Eisenhower is president 1952 until 1960. He is the president for the most of the 1950s. Now, Eisenhower's politics, one good way to describe his politics is quote unquote middle of the road. And that was, maybe like television of the day, it was non-controversial. He didn't really do much to offend. We might say, we'll just say Eisenhower. Say maybe governed, presided. Maybe Eisenhower's domestic and foreign and policies, did not stray away from kind of moderation.